Good afternoon. Welcome to the Bloomington Rotary Club's weekly celebration of service. I'm Steve Wicks, and I'm honored to serve as your president this year. Please silence your electronic devices. Someone carefully had a parking pass stamped, and I have it in my hand. I'll leave it at the front desk, so if you're missing a parking pass, pick it up on the way out. Wearing my Rotary holiday hat, and also my 1968 Rose Bowl sweatshirt that I was given as a 9-year-old. I'd like to say it's a lucky sweatshirt, but they lost the game. But hopefully someone will buy a Rose Bowl sweatshirt for a winning team. Oh, yes. Hoosier Bison is on the sweatshirt. So. Yeah, Hoosier Bison had a run for a number of years in the 60s and 70s and somehow was replaced by Mr. Hoosier Pride. Not a great marketing decision. This day in history, in December 16th, 2019, Mariah Carey's single, All I Want for Christmas Is You, reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 25 years after its release. Glenda Murray will deliver today's reflection.
Thank you. I thought we would just celebrate a little today, one of the volunteer things that this club has done for many, many years. And that is to talk about our years of ringing the bells for the Salvation Army. Next. So I started looking, how many slides do I have? I know I've done this for years and I miss a lot of years, but I'm not going to go through every one. But I found this one of Rex Hillary and someone whom I can't identify. So if any of the rest of you know him, let me know. And many thanks to Steve Moberly, who was our fearless leader in this activity for the last many, many years. And Mike Baker was the president. This was in 2017. In 2018, we went on, and Sarah Laughlin and John Hobson and Beata Hajima, Hank's wife, and Leslie Green were ringing the bells. These were both, I think, in the College Mall. But it's always fun, and Lauren Snyder was our president that year. So then I jumped to this year, and Leslie did a wonderful job closing things out Saturday and 10 days ago. So we thank her. And Patrick and I had volunteered for one of those shifts, and this is his great niece, Murray, who lives in town now and whom we see occasionally, but I had not told her we were going to be there. And so she walked into Kroger's, and there they were. So one of the wonderful things about this is we're helping the Salvation Army. You also get to see all kinds of people. And I had said to Patrick, I don't know how many people we will know at the South Kroger. I was wrong. There were lots of people we knew at the South Kroger, and it's always great fun to visit. And then you have the people. I had this older gentleman who had done the bells, rang the bells for years with his church. And so he proceeded to explain to me how to do it really well. So I said, thank you. But it's always a good thing. And I thought we should just celebrate that a little bit. And then I have two things up here on the table, this being one of them, a Christmas ornament that was from 2002, 2003, that has been given back to the club, and I will put it in the archives. And I thought we'll just close with something that we save some of these things for the archives, and we think about service above self and the things that we do try to do to help each other. So keep moving forward, folks.
Thank you, Glenda. Peggy Frisbee will introduce our guest today.
Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to introduce our guest today. And when I say your name, if you would stand up so we can recognize you. But before I do that, I'm going to do this a little bit in reverse, which is to recognize one of our guests online, who is Vladan Jovanovic. So wherever he is, okay, of course, he's connected with Tracy. Okay, present in our room is Natalie Kravchuk, who is also here in coordination with our speaker for the day. We have Patrick Murray, and many of you know Patrick, associated with Glenda. We have Brad Meyer, who is running for Congress. And we have Becky Wan, and both Brad and Becky are guests of Steve Engel. And finally, we have Robert Hamilton, who is a guest of Jim Bright. And if any of you would like to know more about Rotary, become a member, hopefully, just talk to anybody else in the room. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Peggy. Leslie, were there any other guests online or did we get them all?
We got them all. Thank you.
Great. Birthdays to celebrate. 25th, Amy Osajima. On the 29th, James Wolfe. On the 30th, Tom Boone. And on the 1st, Phil Emerson and Shelley Salee. We have anniversaries, lots of anniversaries. Today, Peggy Frisbee, who just spoke to us, 28 years. On the 17th, Wendell St. John, 6 years. On the 20th, Paul Hazel, 39 years. On the 22nd, sitting in the back, Chris MG, 1 year. And on January 1st, we have a number, Eric Powell and Leanna Powell, 4 years. Jeff Jackson, 1 year. Liz Feidel, sitting there, 21 years. And on the 5th, Gus Shakalis, 10 years. Not very many announcements today. Remember, no Rotary meetings next week and the following week. So we'll be back here the first Tuesday in January. Save the date for the next Rotary Book Club gathering, January 14th, starting at 7 p.m., the home of Judy Schroeder. The group will discuss E. Jean Carroll's Not My Type, One Woman versus a President, All Are Welcome. We need volunteers for various meeting roles in January, and we'll make sure to send out the electronic sign-up sheet. As was reported last week, Jawed, the son-in-law of the Afghan Mohammadi family we sponsored, is in an ICE detention facility in Brazil, Indiana. He has a hearing scheduled in Chicago tomorrow. Our Rotary Club, particularly Dave Meyer, been very involved helping Jawad's wife Amina with logistics, and we've made sure that Jawad has good legal counsel. The hearing itself is a real unknown, so we're just hoping for the best and trying to put Jawad in as good a position as we can. Now we have a celebration of service. I'll jump on a little bit where Glenda started. Some other bell ringers. We have Jim and Ann Bright and Dave Meyer on the right. And then Judy Witt and I on the left. And then Steve Engel, Winston Schindel, and Tracy Jovanovic on the right. And unfortunately, we didn't get pictures of everyone, but we had a real nice turnout. And Jonas Chang, one of our newest members, stepped up to volunteer to coordinate the bell ringing. And here's the list of the people who participated, all club members, although a couple of spouses as well. Ann Bright, Jim Bright, Michelle Cohen, Sally Gaskell, Steve Engel, Tracy Ovanovich, Leslie Kutsinko, Dave Meyer, Glenda Murray, Patrick Murray, Art Omick, Winston Schindel, Tina Swanson, Tim Thrasher, Steve Wicks, Judy Witt, and James Wolfe. So thank you all. And now we have a Paul Harris presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Peggy Frisbee, would you please come up? You've been up here already. Might as well come up again. Of course, Peggy knows all about the Paul Harris Fellow. She's been on the Rotary International Foundation committee with me for a number of years. She's been chair of the committee for a number of years. So she understands the mission of Rotary International and what good work the contributions to Rotary International do. Peggy, I got some information. No, you already gave me approval before you knew you were going to be up here. It's rumored, again, as a child, you had a habit of throwing your plate after every meal. One time I was told the plate flew across the entire room. And then a cousin who witnessed the event came up with the idea of the Frisbee. What? Not likely, but it's a good story. Peggy, you've served our club for many years. As you were recognized today, you've served on the board of the Community Foundation and you've helped a lot of nonprofits in Monroe County. Today, it's my pleasure, if I can find it, to present you with a Paul Harris Fellow +3. Would everyone rise up? It wasn't so bad. What?
Thank you, Mike and Peggy. And now we have a new member induction for a future Paul Harris member.
All right, this is the fun part. You're already coming up, so that's great. Daniel Schlegel, come on over. I'd like to introduce him to the club formally. Daniel has been interested in museums for longer than he can remember. He worked in museums in Ohio, Texas, Colorado, and now Indiana. Through the museums, he picked up essential life skills such as running a 1930s print shop, maybe not so essential anymore, riding a high wheel bike, identifying rocks and minerals, and hanging artwork. He has a bachelor's in history concentration in museums and a minor in anthropology from Kent State University and a master's in public history from Wright State University. And he's accumulated 20 years of museum experience from history and earth science museums as well as archives. He's very excited about starting to work at the Monroe County History Museum Center, especially as we welcome the 250 years. And aside from museums, he enjoys reading, hiking, biking, backpacking, and generally being outside. So he's found Bloomington to be very encouraging of those activities. And now I'd like to invite Sally to do the induction.
Daniel Schlegel, on behalf of the board and membership of the Bloomington Rotary Club, it's a great pleasure to welcome you as the newest member of our club. We look forward to the fellowship that we will share, as well as your participation in the club projects that make our club community, country, and world a better place. Though Rotary is not a political organization, Rotarians are vitally concerned with good citizenship and the election of effective leaders to public office. While Rotary is not a religious organization, it's built on those highest principles that have served as a moral compass for people throughout the ages. Rotary is an organization of business, professional, and community leaders pledged to uphold the highest ethical and moral standards. Rotarians believe that worldwide fellowship and peace can be achieved when people work together and uphold the Rotary motto of service above self. Daniel, you have been chosen for membership in the Bloomington Club because your fellow members believe you to be a leader in our community and because you possess the qualities to champion the message and principles of Rotary. We will now pin you with the distinguishing badge of a Rotarian, your Rotary pin, and we ask that you wear it with pride in your many endeavors and as a symbol of our recognition of your contribution toward a better world through your Rotary membership. Fellow Rotarians, please rise if you are able and welcome our newest member, Daniel Schlegel. And now we'll take some pictures. Done. Thank you, Jeff.
I think we have time for happy dollars. Does anyone have anything that they'd like to share, something they're happy about?
Well, I'm very happy we were successful in hosting 10 of my in-laws at once. And we had a great time at the Nutcracker and at the Uptown Cafe and just hanging out in Bloomington. And just before that, went to see Straight No Chaser. And just before that, the sing-along with Messiah. There are so many great things to do in Bloomington. I know we have some challenges here and there on the campus and in Bloomington some days, but we've got a lot to celebrate as well, and I'm very grateful. And I'm going to give $10 to each of my relatives. That's $100 to happy dollars. Okay, thanks.
It's been a really busy month for me, and I'm just glowing, I think, for all the way through. Starting with my niece was here over the weekend. She lives in San Diego to go to my daughter's wedding shower, which was very exciting. Hannah's getting married on New Year's Eve. And so all my brothers and sisters and my extended family are coming for that. And I'm so delighted for her.
This may be a little bit early, but in Lee's obituary, I mentioned that he had worked on the Rose Bowl floats. And because of that, somebody, excuse me, out in California saw that and notified me that people were making Rose Bowl rose donations to the Rose Bowl float in his honor. So you can watch that when you see the Rose Parade.
Putting in $10 today in celebration of having just completed my last class of the semester. Yay! The class was full of the most inspiring, spectacular presentations by these young students who are innovators in their own right, and paves the way to a future that is very bright.
Speaking of music, I have 5 happy dollars because Constellation Stage and Screen is producing A Christmas Story, and it will make you happy. I guarantee it. Get to the box office and get yourself tickets.
Here's a few dollars for Teachers Warehouse. I'm happy because I'm flying out shortly to San Francisco to be with my daughter and 2 grandchildren, and then we're taking a drive up to Tahoe, so I'm really looking forward to that.
Happy to learn that one of my grandsons will be working at the FAO golf course at IU here soon. Very happy.
Is anybody online?
We do not have any online.
I was extensively away from home all through November and got home just as the start of December. And I thought, going to have to rush to get things done for Christmas. But my daughter-in-laws and my niece had been at the house. And they had everything decorated. It was really beautiful.
As with a lot of other people, I was very happy to see Fernando Mendoza chosen as the Heisman winner this year.
I think I just heard that Coach Signetti was named the AP Coach of the Year. So $20 for that.
Thank you all very much. Judy Schroeder will introduce today's speaker.
It's truly an honor to introduce Bob Kravchuk to you. He has a very distinguished career in the School of Public Affairs, in all of its various names. I've heard him since a Soviet invasion of Ukraine. I've heard him speak twice. Of course, they've been very different as the situation is evolving and devolving. And I've learned so much from him. I learned just recently some things that don't have to do with his bio, but Bob is a lay Dominican. This is something that happens only after 5 years of study and reflection. And I think that's just very interesting. He's a senior fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration, and the 10th edition of a textbook he wrote is going to be issued next week. Those of you in academia know 10 editions are not all that common. So I don't want to talk anymore. I'd rather hear from Bob. Here he is.
Are we on? Can you all hear me? Well, good, good. Thank you, Judy. I really appreciate the introduction. Things are breaking fast, as you can imagine. I can only speak to, it does follow me around. I can only speak to what we know publicly. I have a few contacts in the Pentagon and State Department, but they are likewise, their knowledge is a couple of days sort of in arrears because of the lags that naturally will accompany these kinds of sensitive negotiations. But as you might know, the Trump White House leaks like a sieve, so eventually we do find out what it is that they are talking about. As you may know, there are several competing peace plans that are on the table, and rather than talk about the war, its course, its origins, how it's been going, there may be some in the Q&A. What I'd like to do is just spend 5-7 minutes talking about these comparative peace plans, with a commentary on them, and then maybe we can have a discussion about what you all think. And it's helpful for me to know what it is that people in the community are thinking about the current state of affairs there, because I do occasionally get calls, and it would be useful for me to have a much more informed opinion for the people that do call, not just reporters, but also people in DC. And so if that's all right, what I'd like to do is just talk about some things. You may know and be familiar with some of this, but as far as I can see, there are 4 general approaches that are being discussed a lot. Some are DOA and some are still alive. The one I'd say that's DOE is the so-called US-Russia framework, in heavy quotes. This was the famous peace plan that the U.S. claimed that they wrote themselves, all by themselves, without any help from any third party. Is that me? Okay, sorry. The general outlines are outlined as follows. This framework would freeze the current front lines, with Russia keeping all of its gains. and Ukraine ceding all of Donbass to Russia, including the regions that they haven't yet had a chance to conquer. Ukraine's military would be capped, and so this involves self-disarmament. No NATO for Ukraine ever, so no long-term security. All economic sanctions on Russia would be lifted at once. Ukrainian elections would take place within 100 days. The idea is to eliminate Volodymyr Zelensky as president. And the US, together with the Russians, would decide how to invest the frozen Russian assets. My assessment is that Russia wins, Ukraine loses, and eventually all of Europe is put under great pressure. And this is a non-starter. This isn't going anywhere. The Ukrainians basically said no, and we're not going to sign on to any of this. The Ukrainians have been negotiating a package with the European Union that would categorically reject the land concessions, so there would be no reward for aggression. Ukraine retains full sovereignty over all of its territory, even though it may not militarily control all of it. And so, in other words, the Russians may have troops on it, but the Ukrainians retain their claim to the territory, their legal claims under international law. Not clear how that would end up. This is essentially this kind of a treaty and really represents a kind of a hiatus in the fighting. It's not really a permanent end because it's really not a just peace, so it wouldn't be a lasting peace. Ukraine would receive NATO-like security guarantees under the EU plan. A membership path would be open to the European Union. War crimes would be prosecuted to the fullest. Ukraine would begin to rebuild, probably with the frozen Russian assets used as seed money or at least collateral for loans. The prisoners would be released. Sorry, this is really awkward. I'm sorry about that. And Ukraine would retain all of its armed forces. So in other words, Ukraine wins, Russia loses. As far as the Russians are concerned, that's a non-starter. The French, the Germans, and the United Kingdom have developed a modified proposal that basically amends the US-Russia proposal. They would not cede unoccupied territory, but Russia would keep its military gains to date. The military cap would remain. In other words, Ukraine would have to probably reduce its military. They're talking about on the order of 50%. There would be no US participation over the disposition of the frozen Russian assets. They would return to Russia entirely. Ukraine would have a path to both NATO and EU membership. Now, what the Europeans are trying to do is move in the direction of a kind of a win-win strategy for both sides. It surrenders territory and rewards aggression to a point, but the precedent would be the winter war against Finland, where Russia retained permanently a slice of Finland after that conflict. This is a non-starter because the Russian demands remain as follows, and these are what Lavrov refers to as the root causes of the conflict. Ukrainian neutrality. They want Ukraine to be a buffer zone permanently. No NATO or EU membership ever. Ukrainian demilitarization. No army, no armed forces at all. The annexed territories would be annexed into Russia permanently as part of the Russian Federation, essentially leaving Ukraine vulnerable to further Russian aggression. The current status, as far as I can tell, as of last night, is that the US and Europe seem to be closer to offering a NATO-like security guarantee to Ukraine. So Zelensky is upbeat. As of this morning, I was reading, yet unconfirmed, that the United States and the NATO powers would extend NATO-like security guarantees, but not membership, to Ukraine, with a caveat. Pardon me. The caveat is as follows. If Ukraine should ever attack Russia without cause, in heavy quotes, the guarantees are null and void. This leaves it open to a false flag operation, which the Russians are famous for doing. Russian troops wearing Ukrainian uniforms attacking a Russian border post and the security guarantees just fall off the table. They wouldn't be worth the paper they're printed on. And so, my own assessment of the situation is as it was a year ago. The real negotiation is the war. There's not sufficient overlap in the interests of the Ukrainians or the Russians yet to put in place a just and lasting peace. And so neither one of them wants to give up anything. They're going to continue to fight until one of them can gain the advantage in this business, and then we may see movement towards a peace. But in the meantime, the fighting will continue. It's particularly brutal for the Russians. They're losing between 30 and 40,000 men a month. That's killed, wounded, missing in action. Generally, these are the non-Russian ethnic minorities in Russia. Putin has not gone after yet the primarily ethnic Russian population that exists in that nexus between St. Petersburg and in the northwest and Moscow in the center of the country. So far, they're relatively untouched. But we have a situation here that it looks like it's really not going to be resolved anytime soon, and that may become more apparent in the next week or two. Now, if I can step away from that for a minute and sort of give a personal reflection, I don't think that the Russians will be capable of carrying on the conflict more than another 9 months or a year. Their sovereign wealth fund is being depleted. The ruble is worth less than 1 penny per ruble. The population has lost their life savings. They're running out of men, and this is particularly important, men of military service age. Now, remember, to keep the military machine going, they're going to have to populate the factories with workers. The problem is there aren't sufficient numbers of healthy military age service males to be able to do both. And as a consequence, they're going to reach the breaking point sometime soon. The Ukrainians also have a breaking point, but nobody's quite sure exactly where that is, because they didn't break after the first onslaught in the first months of the war, and they've been pretty resilient since then. And so my opinion is that the Russians would break if more sanctions were put in place, and if we were to provide military assistance up to and including I'm blanking on the missiles. Gosh, the Tomahawk cruise missiles. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. The Tomahawk cruise missiles. Nuclear capable, but so are the other missiles the Ukrainians are shooting at Russia. So whatever the Russians are claiming, complaining about, that's just a red herring, literally, a red herring. So I'm not very sanguine about the future. I think this is going to come to a head sometime in the next year. I do know that the Poles and the Germans are rearming themselves to the teeth rapidly. The Poles have been doubling their military budget every year since 2022. The Germans, under Chancellor Merz, have really stepped it up as well. There was you might have seen a segment on 60 Minutes this past weekend where they talked about this. Defense Minister Pistorius is a very serious man, and he's really applying the pedal to the metal as rapidly as they can. I don't know, when you have a military buildup like this, it just increases the likelihood that military will be employed. Just having it to begin with is a problem. But well, the old saying is, if you want peace, prepare for war. If you're well prepared, then people will leave you alone. And Europe needs to be better prepared. The critical year they're talking about is 2029. For the United States, it might actually be sooner than that, 2027, and that involves the Chinese and Taiwan. And just speaking, as an American, looking at the situation of our military currently, we really are not prepared to fight 2 wars at the same time. We're just not. And so when I look at the Russia-Chinese relationship, the chances that there would be the likelihood of coordination between the two, just that bothers me. That would be my worst case scenario for us all, right? Well, in any case, I think I'll just stop right there and ask. Sorry to spoil your lunch, but I'll ask if there are any questions either here or on Zoom I see there's a bunch. Mike is going to be the moderator.
What are the estimates for how many people Ukraine is losing every month?
Well, it's less than the Russians. It's hard to estimate, because they're not telling, right? But the Center for the Study of War, General Keene's outfit, and the British Ministry of Defense are talking about 600 to 800 a day, which is also huge. You should also know the average age on the front line in Ukraine is 45. They are drafting men down to the age of 25 now. The Trump administration is pressing them, saying you can't be serious unless you're going to take 18-year-olds. What President Zelensky is worried about is if he reduces the draft to 18, that they'll storm the Bastille and take him out into the street and cut off his head. Especially without American involvement and American weapons. They're just worried about their sons' lives being wasted in a losing cause. By the way, I don't think they're losing. I just think that without American involvement, the chances that they will lose are much greater.
You partially answered my question, but what is the general mood of the Ukrainian population?
Resolute, tired, angry, mostly at the Russians. Most of the Ukrainians I talk to, tell me that they could never forgive the Russians. That this basically, there's families on both sides of the border. And they don't talk to each other currently. This is it. They said this really has soured things for generations. It probably has.
How worried should we be of the dissonance between where the president and his administration seems to be and where members of Congress are, who've basically been pretty silent publicly, but I think behind the scenes there's a dissonance there. And if your assessment over the next 9 to 12 months could be pivotal, how do you see that working on our end?
Yeah, the divides are even, extend further than that. It's 2 in 3 Americans, when polled, will say they want to support Ukraine. Even if you ask the majority, the majority of Republicans behind the scenes, off the record in Congress, will support Ukraine, but they won't cross this president. And I think the problem here is that the administration has other ideas about how it wanted to spend its scarce political capital in the first 2 years of the administration. Because believe me, once we hit the midterms, Trump is a lame duck. Increasingly, this ball game is over. Whatever he's gotten up until that point is all he's going to get, more than likely. Their gains will become fewer and farther between. So he's had this 2-year window to get things going. It's one of the few things I agree with Steve Bannon on. He had 2 years, and he's just got another basically 11 months to go at this point. I think that you're going to see increasing dissonance among the Republicans in Congress as he becomes more of a lame duck. By the way, this will also depend to some extent upon the conflict now, the silent, quiet conflict that sort of everybody knows about between Rubio and Vance. Vance is a hawk on Ukraine. He just wants to cut and run. Rubio, on the other hand, is much, much more pro-Ukrainian. Frankly, I think he's actually the far more intelligent of the two. As smart as Vance is, I think Rubio is much, much more polished and nuanced in his understanding of the conflict. And so depending upon which one of them will prevail for Trump's ear, especially in the next 11 months, will have an outsized influence over the other.
You said that they were having 30 to 40,000 casualties a month. Can you kind of frame that and orient us, the total losses we had in, say, Korea and Vietnam?
Well, 50,000 in Vietnam, or 55,000, depending on who you count among advisors and others. Russians have lost about 1 million, maybe 1.2 million since the war began the war actually began in 2014, since the invasion in 2022. It's about 1.2 million. By comparison, in World War II, we were losing 250 guys a week, and the Ukrainians are losing 600 to 800 a day. right? So this is a fight for survival. And, you know, and despite all the press talking about it's, you know, it's a draw, it's a standoff, the battle lines are drawn, it's trench warfare, that line moves around a lot. This is a war of mobility. They hunker down to protect themselves against the drones, but the drones can't see or fly all the time. And so the lines do move around primarily at night. You know, and so for all the much vaunted, well, you know, the Russians have entered Pokrovsk. Well, the Russians have been in Pokrovsk for 18 months on the outskirts. They haven't taken the main areas, the railhead, the major highway intersections, the Ukrainians still control. And the Ukrainians have taken back a lot of territory in Pokrovsk in the last 2 weeks. So those lines do move around, right? It's not the same kind of mobile warfare that we would have seen, in, let's say, in World War II when tanks really made a difference. You know, as you know, drones have neutralized the effectiveness of armor on the battlefield. So as a consequence, you know, it's small units, primarily at the squad and platoon level, that are moving around, that are making the big difference. And by the way, to a person on the front line, the Ukrainians, they extol the virtues of that old-fashioned Yankee 50 caliber machine gun. I say that settles all questions pretty quickly.
I just wanted to know, since the U.S. has no skin in this war, are we continuing to send adequate armaments and drones to Ukraine?
Well, I'll answer the question first, and that is that no, we should send more, and we could do more. But as for having skin in the game, you know, even if the United States were to follow through on the threat to withdraw from NATO, if Poland, never mind Germany, but if Poland were in threat of being overrun by the Russians, we would be back in Europe in a heartbeat. Europe is our most important trading partner, bar none. Germany is the third largest economy in the world. They are important to our economic and political future. Despite all the criticism, which, by the way, isn't, the administration's criticism isn't directed at individual countries, sometimes leaders, but not the countries. It's directed at the EU, because the administration in Washington sees the EU decision structures as taking too long and require a lot of consultation and are not able to move as fast. And so, you know, when Trump says they're worthless and weak, he really means the decision structure. That's really his major complaint, is focus there. But yeah, I know, I think we have an interest. We have an interest in the outcome of this war, a very serious interest. Interestingly, the strategic objectives that the Russians set out at the very beginning have not been met. In fact, it's gone against them. They now have 800 miles longer border with NATO now that the Finns have joined the alliance. And their chances of being able to dominate in the Baltic Sea are greatly lessened as a consequence of the Swedes being in the game as well, right? So strategically, they really haven't made any gains, right? But the real action now is not along the Finnish border. The real action is Poland. If the Russians were able then to reestablish the Warsaw Pact, just let's for a moment sort of, that's not realistic, but for a moment, let's say they had that opportunity. What is currently a 1,600 kilometer front to defend becomes 200 or 300 kilometers, because now you're butting right up against the Carpathian Mountains. Right? To the south, you have Romania. To the north, you have Germany. So if you're able to dominate Poland, you're pretty secure geographically. And I'm convinced this is the Russian objective, is to secure their western border.
So I got
Lots,
two questions actually. One, what's been the progression of public opinion in Russia over the course of the war? How do civilians there feel about things over time? And then I've heard that the Russian nuclear capabilities have been diminished just from lack of maintenance. Is that any way a threat, even for smaller weapons, tactical level weapons?
Yeah. There's some opinion that if the Russians pushed the button, half of the birds would explode in their silos. You know, if they make their missiles the way they make their washing machines, that's probably not far from right. Right, but consumer appliances have never been their strength. right? And so they rattle the nuclear saber a lot, but they don't want to go there. They're not going to launch a nuclear war, right? With respect to popular opinion in Russia, I mean, Russia's big. There's a lot of people. So there's pockets of dissonance around the country. I would say probably on balance, it's trending away from the Kremlin at this point. There are increasing incidents of sabotage and Russian guerrillas opposed to the Putin regime operating within Russia. Some of those oil refineries and others that the Ukrainians take credit for were actually destroyed by Russian guerrillas that are fighting the regime. They just want their country to become a normal European country. So that there is some opinion that's trending in that direction. I've also noticed recently that in sort of these, it's not a really credible sample, but in these sort of open mic, sort of ask the man on the street kinds of things, where people go around, Westerners generally, and ask Russians, ordinary Russians on the street, even in Red Square, what do you think about the war? And they say, it's a terrible thing, we should stop. We should never have invaded. And they're speaking more openly about this, and not in hushed tones either. So I mean, your guess is as good as mine, but I'm thinking that the Russian population are tired of this as well, and well, this leaves Putin in a very bad position. 1.2 million casualties, territorial gains. I mean, think about this now. Contemplate this statistic. In the 12 months, roughly, since the beginning of 2025, the Russian territorial gains in Ukraine have been no larger than 2 small counties in Indiana. And they've expended over 200,000 troops getting it. At that rate, it would take them 100 years and 15 million casualties to subdue Ukraine. That's not going to happen. He's already lost. It's a war he's lost, but he thinks he can win the peace, which is why he continues. And frankly, I think we've given him reason to believe that this prospect might be true.
Probably the saddest impact of any war is on children. And what has the impact of the war been on the Ukrainian children? And what will happen in these negotiations with the many thousands who've reportedly been kidnapped? What's going to happen to those kids?
That as far as I know, to my knowledge, that hasn't been one of an element of any of these peace proposals. I know there are international organizations, UNICEF in particular, the UNHCR, that are looking at it, that are lobbying the Russians constantly. But Putin has a population problem. The average Russian family has 1.4 children. Replacement is 2.1. Right? And the effect is exponential. The longer you go without increasing the birth rate, the less likely you are to have the population you need to increase the birth rate. So it's a spiral downwards. For mathematicians who are present, both the first and the second derivatives are negative. Right?
Do you have numbers on Ukrainian children who have been kidnapped?
The estimate is about 12,000. Some have been returned, and in some cases, very brave Ukrainian mothers have traveled to Russia to track down the kids and brought them back. But those are, I mean, it's a handful, right? So it's a lot. And the Russians want to turn them into soldiers. I don't know if you've seen the photographs of Russian kindergartens where they've dressed them in battle fatigues and walk around with wooden rifles. Yeah.
2 questions. The first, can you remind us what guarantees were made to Ukraine when they disarmed their nuclear arsenal way back when? Second question, I was surprised to read this week about a U.S. deal with Belarus involving freeing of political prisoners and approving them as a potash supplier. Is there any significance, any larger significance to that deal?
Yeah, so answer the second question first, if I can. Potash is an important fertilizer. It's an important source of nitrogen. And when the war began and the supplies of potash and other nitrogenous materials from the former Soviet space slowed to a trickle, African populations were suffering because they weren't able to grow sufficient amounts of food to be able to feed themselves. Right? If you think back to the so-called Arab Spring, you know, all the optimism of that period about 15 years ago, what caused the uprising in the street was a shortage of food, and what caused that shortage of food was the lack of fertilizer for growth. So this is really, really terribly important. So it may not be altogether that bad a development, may be very positive. Respecting the so-called security guarantees under the Budapest Memorandum. You have to read the memorandum. There are no security guarantees. The language commits the signatories to respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine and all the former Soviet republics. But there were no consequences mentioned for violations. Right? So it's become kind of like an internet myth as this thing has sort of evolved now. It's oh, well, the West isn't worth its guarantees. Well, it didn't make any guarantees, frankly. And the other one that circulates too, it's another myth, is that Gorbachev was promised that they would never move the NATO border closer to the Kremlin. It was discussed. James Baker brought it up during negotiations. Gorbachev opted for the money instead, for the financial assistance. So it wasn't part of any formal deal with the Russians. It can't even be called a moral commitment because it was discussed and it stayed on the table and it never was incorporated into an agreement. Oh, okay. Sorry, Don.
Okay, so if the U.S. says we're not going to supply any more weapons, is it likely that NATO would step up, and would it even matter?
It can. The Storm Shadow missiles are very, very good. Many of the NATO countries have already, if you look at the Dutch, the Danes, the Spanish, they've given all of their tanks, all of them, to Ukraine. The Dutch and the Danish, their F-16s, all of them to Ukraine, all of them. The thought was, if it gets to the point we need to use them to defend ourselves, it's already too late, right? And with respect to the American, let's talk about the American armaments that we send to them. The vast majority of them were very close to their expiration date. It would actually cost the United States money to decommission them and render them inert. Better to give them to the Ukrainians and let them shoot them at Russians. So this notion that we've given, first of all, $350 billion is a made-up number. So somebody in the Oval Office is mansplaining, right? Number one. Yeah. Number two, you know, I taught public finance for 35 years. The most elusive question you can ask in government is, what does it cost? Right? So is it book value? Is it replacement value? Is it historical value? Is it what you could get on the arms market today? I mean, what price do you want to put on these things? To some great extent, because these things were purchased with money in the past, deficits were incurred, bonds were issued, this all has become part of the money supply that's out there. These weapons really don't cost anything. There may be an opportunity cost if we have to use some of them ourselves, but if they're going to expire sometime soon at expense, then we might as well give them away.
This is a historical question in some sense, but it has the issue of, in fact, Ukraine becoming part of NATO. We know how we reacted when the Russians put missiles in Cuba. Was it a strategic mistake? And would have made a difference if basically that's never going to happen because we're not gonna missiles on Russia's border.
I'm not sure that the two situations are directly analogous, despite the parallels that the Kremlin likes to draw with that situation. It only works, you know, among Western populations, but among informed folks, you know, the Russians pulled missiles out of Cuba, and we took missiles, intermediate range missiles, mainly Nikes, out of Turkey. Big deal, right? The Russians today have nuclear submarines in the Caribbean Sea, submerged. They're off the Atlantic coast of the US, just like ours, off of their coast, ready to open up and empty their payloads anytime. upon orders. It's just the situation continues in place. All this nonsense about, well, we de-targeted their cities, they de-targeted our cities. Sure, sure. Yeah. I've got a bridge in Brooklyn you can take off my hands real cheap, right? No, I don't believe that. I don't know. It's sort of my wildest fantasies. I keep thinking that, if either Reagan or Nixon were in the White House in 2022 or even late 2021, they probably would have put elements of the 82nd 101st Airborne and the 1st Armored Division into central Ukraine, not ask the Russians to say, okay, by the way, we just showed up. Bring it on. He wouldn't dare. He wouldn't dare. If I know the Pentagon, they have every Russian asset on the territory of Ukraine targeted from minute to minute. The Russians misstep, within a couple of hours, their conventional weapons in Ukraine would be obliterated. The American troops that are in Poland and Romania are within 3 kilometers of the border, and they're on a 15-minute alert. They're ready to go in at any time. That's mainly to keep the Russians, right, on their toes, and also mainly to keep the Belarusians in place, right, in defensive positions, right? So it's not a great place to be, but I don't expect that order is actually going to seriously be given. Although, keep this in mind, if the Russians ever did, by chance, break out into open territory in central Ukraine and start making a stab for Kiev, I believe that the Poles would intervene unilaterally. And then nobody knows how that ends. And I'll say this much more. I think we'd be foolish if we didn't join them and overwhelming force and just make it happen. I don't think the Russians respond with nuclear weapons. Their own territory is not threatened.
One last quick question. Has the EU stepped up with more material support?
You mean the EU nations individually or the EU itself?
It's itself, or all the nations. I mean, are they getting?
Yes, they are getting material support from the individual nations, but the EU itself is participating in creating an investment fund to rebuild Ukraine after the war, which poses challenges of its own. As you may know, that's nothing dirtier on this planet than a battlefield. And it'll be very, very difficult to clean it all up. Not to mention the millions of landmines that have been placed. It's going to be a huge problem, a huge rebuilding effort. As you also may know, that the former ambassador, Ukraine ambassador to the US, she's just stepped away and returned to Ukraine. Oksana Makarova is an IU graduate.
We have a question online, if it's possible.
Yes.
Do we have time?
Go ahead, Vladen.
Yeah, I had a question, actually. I read James Baker's memoir a few years ago, and to the best of my recollection, he was pretty explicit in saying that not only he promised Gorbachev that NATO won't be expanded in the former Eastern Bloc states, but if I remember correctly, it was also a subject that was breached with Bush Sr. When he met Gorbachev, and that he made some statement like that. The way you explained it doesn't jive with what I believe I read. Did I not memorize well, or can you comment on that?
Yeah, I don't think that it contradicts what I said at all. They did discuss it, but there was no agreement in place, nothing written, nothing promised behind the scenes. It was a discussion.
That's not my impression. I agree that there was nothing written down, but Baker was, as far as I remember, explicit that he promised no expansion. Okay, listen, I'll check. I have the book somewhere, so I'll check again.
Well, I hope I didn't spoil your lunch.
Listen to you all day. Fascinating. In honor of your, excuse me, in honor of your talk, a donation will be made this quarter to the Lake Monroe Water Fund. I'd like to thank today's volunteers, Diana Hoffman, Peggy Frisbee, Judy Schroeder, Leslie Katsinko, Glenda Murray, Sarah Laughlin, Michael Shermis, Jeff Richardson, Mike Baker, Tracy Ivanovich, Marcy Hibbard. Next meeting will be on January 6th in the Frangipani Room. Brett Rothstein will speak about the appeal of puzzles. Join us to learn more. Please remember, we're not meeting the next 2 weeks, so enjoy and savor the holiday season. Tyler, if you would share the graphic for the four-way test. Please stand if you are able. Of the things we think, say, or do, first, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill and better friendships? Fourth, will it be beneficial to all concerned? And fifth, is it fun?